Hey, what's up, and welcome to this episode of EST, the podcast for established church leaders by established church leaders. My name is Josh.
My name is Sam, and my whole goal on this episode is to put Micah on the spot and make him feel very uncomfortable.
Well, if you are just now tuning in, we have Micah back, one of the part of the original host of the show of EST. He's been gone for a while, doing other things, and if you don't know what those are, you got to have listen to last week's episode. But we're going to carry on the conversation about religious liberty. But first, Sam, tell them about church teams.
Church teams. Yeah, church teams will be going with us over to Rainer on Leadership. So subscribe over there. Josh and I are carrying this conversation at Rainer on Leadership, and church teams will be there sponsoring the episode. So we'll be interviewing Boyd on that spot, and excited about that. Boyd's the co-founder and somebody we absolutely love. He loves serving churches. So go to churchteams.com and check out his content, check out the services that they provide. They offer technology solutions for churches, and they have a scalable system when it comes to church size and price point. So if you are a smaller church and you can't afford a lot, they've got something for you. If you're a larger church and you need a lot, they've got something for you. So go check out churchteams.com and say hello to Boyd. Tell him that we sent you. All right, Micah, welcome back.
Let me just say, Sam, first of all, thank you. And if you think you can make me uncomfortable, I sat in a room with a rabbi who looked at me in the eye and said, "So do you think I'm going to hell?" So I promise you, whatever question you're going to ask me is not going to make me not make me have to really think through an answer more than that one.
Don't challenge me now. I was just joking. I may take you up on the challenge.
Just joking.
All right. So we talked a little bit last week about interfaith and what that really means, and how that's kind of what you're doing right now, and how you don't have to compromise your conservative principles. If that's, I know we've got a broad audience, but a lot of our audience would say they're conservative evangelicals, and not all of them would, but a lot of them would. And you don't have to compromise that in order to actually have a conversation with somebody who has a different faith than you. So go listen to that episode. It was really good. Micah had all sorts of practical tips and some ideas there that I found very, very useful. This episode, though, I want to focus on religious liberty because it's something I feel, very passionately about. I know you do as well, Mike. It's part of what you do. So you've got this history with Roger Williams, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1635 by the Puritans for spreading new and dangerous opinions. So what new and dangerous opinions do you have that's going to get you kicked off this podcast?
Well, let's talk about the Puritans for a second, who everybody loves to talk about how the Puritans came to the U.S. for religious freedom. But in truth, what they did,
persecuted others.
Well, they came to the U.S. for religious freedom for themselves and no one else. It's good for me and not for thee.
I to this day, I do not understand why the Puritans are so loved. Like, I get it. There's some really good theology there. There's
fantastic,
the Protestant work ethic. There's lots of good. But man, there's lots of bad too. So it's kind of like our tribe that we all used to be a part of, the Southern Baptist Convention. And, it's like there's good there and there's also some bad there. We need to recognize both. But yeah, I don't drink the Puritan Kool-Aid. I don't drink the Puritan.
No, I mean, it's like everything else, Sam. It's like you and me. I mean, there's good stuff and then there's some not so good stuff. And I mean, if we can't recognize that the world is not binary, everything's either good or bad, it's all a mix of both. And
not me though. I'm just 100% great.
Yeah, Josh, we can all see your Texas forever on your thing, and we can see your hook'em horns that you're just putting up. So you just disqualified yourself.
Am I doing it right?
No, that's rock on. This is hook'em horns.
No, yeah. That's all right.
So when we were in South Carolina, I don't know if it's still a thing in Columbia. We would do, like this. Yeah. But yeah, Micah does the Gator chomp.
Go Gators, baby. Go Gators. Sam, you live close to God's country where you're at, man. You're not far from the Gators.
Lots of Gator fans here, and I like the Gators. I'll be honest with you.
That's Sam's evidence of God's blessing on Sam's life.
Hey, we played the Gators this year. It was fun.
Well, yeah, we also had a walk-on. We literally, when we played you guys, we had a walk-on non-scholarship quarterback who was running the show for us.
Y'all filled your team, we filled our team, and see how it works out.
We filled our team. They just all kept getting injured. Yeah, so let's talk about religious freedom, religious liberty a little bit. I think, all three of us come from a Baptist tradition. All three of us would say, I think we're Baptist in the historical sense of what it means to be a Baptist, what that means in terms of religious liberty, religious freedom. Right. I mean, I mean, call it what it is. Religious liberty, religious freedom exists in the U.S. because of Baptists. Roger Williams. Then you look at John Leland and his engagement with Thomas Jefferson. If you look at Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Virginia Congress that became the Religious Liberty Statute in the Virginia legislature, I mean, that all was rooted in a Baptist posture towards religious liberty and religious freedom. So I know there's a lot of listeners who are not Baptist, and pardon me if we're trumpeting that.
The reason we don't have state churches, like
that's right,
50 states,
that's right,
like that each state of the union does not have its own state church, is because of Baptists.
And let's just say that at one point in the U.S. there were state churches.
Yes,
early on. There were. And so what changed that, the course correction, was those early Baptists, starting with Roger Williams in Rhode Island, and then moving forward. I think I mentioned this in the last one. I learned a few months ago that Obadiah Holmes is my grandfather, like 11 generations back. And he was a disciple of Roger Williams, pastored First Baptist Newport, Rhode Island for 30 years, I think. So here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to say that every person has to have the freedom to freely choose their own belief system. And religious freedom is basically the protection to that end. We're trying to protect every person's right to freely choose what they believe. The reality is, if we genuinely, and I tell people this all the time, when you're scared of engaging with people of other beliefs on a level playing field, so if pluralism scares you, and let's just talk about a classic definition of pluralism. Classic definition of pluralism basically means multiple faiths present, or a plurality of faiths present, none of which are being privileged, right? So a pluralistic environment is a plurality of religions present, none being privileged. When you're talking about a genuinely pluralistic context and it scares you, that says to me that, one, either you've not really thought through it that well, or number two, you have a lack of confidence in the strength and beauty of your own faith tradition. I'm not scared of my faith being on a level playing field with anyone else, because I believe that Christianity is beautiful and good and true. And I believe that Jesus is all of those things. And I don't have to deny that John 14:6 exists and that Jesus is the way, the truth, and life, and no one comes to the Father but by him. I don't have to disavow that or not believe that, to at the same time advocate for every person to have the freedom to choose their faith freely. And so what we're doing with our organizations is trying to protect that right. And we've seen tremendous strides in some of the places where we're working, places like Vietnam and Uzbekistan and Pakistan and other places that still, don't get me wrong, have long ways to go, but have taken huge steps over the last decade. And we've been able to be a part of a lot of that. The sad thing is now, when we talk to folks around the world, the reality is we're declining in that regard in the U.S. We're moving in the wrong direction in that regard in the U.S. And so, yes, we want to continue to work around the world, but we've got to work to advocate. And here's the key to religious freedom. Religious freedom does not take root until the majority understands their responsibility to advocate and protect the minority. And that means in America, the big 800-pound gorilla in the room, it's the Christian community. And we have to be able to advocate for, not for what they believe, but for their right to believe, whatever it is they want to believe, and protect those rights for religious minorities. And that includes Buddhist and atheist and agnostics and Hindu and Muslim and Baha'i and whatever the case might be. And that doesn't mean that I agree with them. It just means that I believe that no faith is authentic unless it's freely chosen. And I'm going to have to advocate for that, for every person to have that right. So if you want controversy, Sam, I'm positive there are going to be some folks who are probably flipping the podcast off right now, and they're thinking to themselves, what is wrong with this Yahoo?
No. Well, we welcome free thought here, and you're free to disagree and engage with us.
Please do.
That's part of what makes America great, is the marketplace of ideas. And I think Christianity will ultimately be the one that surfaces in the marketplace of ideas because it's the one that's true. Yeah. But when you force it on people, it becomes something different.
Yeah, that's exactly
and
right.
It's not true faith. And this gets to something that is, probably overdone, but still a threat, is Christian nationalism, and this idea that, we need to set up what amounts to a monarchy with a Christian prince, basically do away with democracy and make Christianity the privileged faith in the United States, some Christian nationalists would take it so far as to say only 1 or 2 or 3 races at most, and then everyone else has got to go.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think any of this will prevail, and
Right.
I don't think that they're going to succeed in their plans, but there is a growing movement, even if it's small, of people who genuinely believe this. I was engaging with one online, which is probably not a good idea, but they would say things like, we're a Christian nation, which I would like agree with, but we are defining that differently. And I would say, okay, well, if you want to set up this Christian monarchy, which kind of Christian? Well, he ended up being more reformed in this case.
Mhm.
And he told me that he would force all Christians to sprinkle babies. And I said, well, as a Baptist, I ain't doing that. Well, then I'm going to jail because I'm not properly administrating the sacraments. So, but before we go too far down this line of, hey, we're a Christian nation. Okay, I agree. We're founded on Judeo-Christian values, and a lot of the founding fathers were Christians. But that doesn't mean that we can set up a Christian monarchy in this nation and then force a particular brand of Christianity on people. And that's what I see coming if they succeed. They won't. It's just not a big enough movement. I think enough people will push back on this.
It's
that
not
gonna
popular
be
enough.
Yeah, it's not popular enough. It's never going to be a thing. But my point is, there are people out there that are saying these things that are kind of polluting the conversation. So how would you respond to that?
So I would say a couple of things. I would say, one, it's not popular enough to get enough traction to become the law. Having said that, it's more popular than I think we wish was true. And I think probably in each of our churches, there are people who are in this camp, whether they would
not at mine. I've scared them all away.
Yeah, but there's still probably someone in your church who's listening to a podcast or reading a Facebook post or something along those lines, and they're not necessarily following the thought process to its logical end, right? Like you just tried to argue there, Sam. They're just thinking, I love Jesus. Jesus is right. Why doesn't it make sense for that just to be the expectation for people? And I would say a couple things. One, I'm less comfortable using the Christian nation language than you are. I want to be able to define that term pretty specifically. I would use it in a more descriptive manner in saying, sort of describing who we have been, yes, and less in a prescriptive manner. I think you've got a lot of sort of the Christian nationalism movement, which I think you're right, is somewhat overblown. A lot of things that are called Christian nationalism aren't Christian nationalism. If you care
unfortunately,
about your
the
faith,
liberals they've hijacked that term, and anyone that's like me that says, "Hey, I think we need to have revival in the land," all of a sudden I'm a Christian nationalist. Like, that's not what I am.
It's like Marxism or woke or wokeism, whatever the case. They're all hijacked and then they sort of expanded. So yes, if you care about your faith and you want your faith to be influential in the way you think, that doesn't make you a Christian nationalist. But for actual Christian nationalism that wants to sort of enshrine it or encode it into the law of the land, I think one of the things they've got to grapple with, there's actually an interesting, I just was reading it last week, fascinating research project that studied countries that allowed faith to exist, sort of just pluralism, no faith was privileged, or Christian faith was persecuted, or Christian faith was privileged, right? That's what they looked at. They looked at those three environments. And what they found is that Christianity flourished most effectively. Which of the three do you think was most effective for the flourishing of Christianity?
Well, I'm going to say pluralist.
The pluralistic context is correct.
Mm-hmm.
Where Christians were persecuted was the second most effective.
Right.
And where Christianity was privileged was the worst model for the flourishing of the Christian faith. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the theology for a minute. Yes, absolutely. There's a huge theological problems with this. There's a pragmatic problem. It just doesn't work. And we've got thousands of years of history to show us that every time you privilege it, it fails because nobody likes to be told what to do. This is fundamentally who we are. There's not a one of us who have kids who, when we say, because I said so, that's why, our kids go, well, golly, mom, golly, dad, I love that. I'm going to go do what you've asked me to do. I mean, we can force them to because we have authority, but it doesn't change their heart. So this is it's a bad theology. It's a bad practice. It doesn't make sense.
Well, let me ask you this. So if I'm listening to these sort of conversations and so there's the extreme where I'm going to advocate hold on a second. I'm going to advocate or legislate my conservative Baptist version of Christianity on everybody. That's an extreme over here. That's not a good idea. I think the vast majority of people in the pews or in Christianity, or maybe just the vast majority of pastors, are going, okay, but what about the areas like where my view on, human value or worth, like humans have value from conception to natural death, or even my view on marriage between one man and one woman. These things, they are very much informed and shaped by my Christian biblical views, right? How does that not? Do you see what I'm trying to ask? But maybe I'm not asking.
I think
how do I advocate for that, vote for that,
Yeah, of course.
without legislating my faith on other people in a religious freedom sense?
I think there's a difference between moral and ethical decisions that have to be made on a regular basis and stipulating what particular religious convictions one has to have in relationship to how they know, experience, or worship God. So I would say this: when it comes to moral and ethical commitments that we're going to make as a nation, I think a really good example of this is in the past 7 days in the United Kingdom. I don't know if you guys are following this with the Parliament that has pushed forward, advanced this bill to legalize euthanasia, right? So to make euthanasia legal. All three of us on here would have an argument to be made that that's an ethical, moral failure on their part. And we would make that argument from a theological position, right? We have a theological posture that takes us to that argument. However, if we're going to win that debate on a national scale in a pluralistic context, our argument has to be more than just the Bible says so. That can be what drives me, but I'm going to make an argument, a broader argument with the larger community about how this position leads to a lack of human flourishing. Listen, whether it's the LGBTQ argument or racial issues or child welfare, whatever the argument that is winning the day is the argument that is popularly believed as best for human flourishing. When you can make an argument that whatever the decision is bad for human flourishing, you can win the day. And so this is one of those things I think is important for those of us who are Christians living out our faith in the public square. Yes, absolutely. What the Bible says is what drives us to the decisions we make. But we've got to recognize that if they're not a Christian, they're not going to necessarily agree with that. And so in a democratic environment where people are not necessarily Christians, we have to make a broader, larger argument. And absolutely, I'm not going to keep my faith out of it. It drives me crazy when a politician says, well, I'm a Christian, but it doesn't influence my decision making.
Yeah.
I don't want to offend anybody too much, but I would say I'm not sure you're a Christian if that's the case. Like you can't, I mean, unless you die to yourself, you can't come to Jesus, right? Like all of my desires and opinions all have to go away, and I have to replace them with the Lord's desires and opinions. I mean, His opinion is law in my mind. And so, yes, absolutely. If I'm in the Christian sphere, if I'm in the public sphere, I'm going to make a biblical theological argument, but I'm also going to make an even broader argument than just that. Yeah. I'm going to say, here's what fuels me, but here are some of the other elements of human flourishing that help me to arrive at this conclusion. Because ultimately, every one of us believes that what the Bible calls us to contributes in the greatest way to human flourishing. If that's the case, right? The Bible's not advocating for any positions that inhibits human flourishing. So what we've got to be able to do is take those biblical principles and draw from that sort of these broad-based ideals or principles that appeal to a large segment of the culture. And if we can win that argument, we can win the day.
I'm actually finding this same thing to be true. Not obviously, I'm not a politician, but the shepherding conversations.
You're a pastor. You're more a politician than you think.
Well, we do a lot of politics, but the conversations, talking specifically about LGBT, most of the people that I'm engaging in on this conversation, which I find myself engaging all the time now, is really they already acknowledge, yeah, that's what the Bible says, but they have that. And where I found much more, fertile ground in the conversation is saying, look, I'm not even arguing from a biblical standpoint. Let's just talk about science then. If you want to talk about science, let's talk about science. Let's talk about nature. Let's just talk about all of the observable characteristics that we can. And once you start talking about those sort of things, it really does say, and I'm not choosing science over Scripture. I'm saying science.
They live in complementary relationship with one another.
They support one another.
That's right.
And that almost becomes this thing that's like, that makes sense to people.
if you think
He is
about
consistent.
if you think about the LGBTQ argument in particular, the mantra has been love is love, right? For the past few years. That's been this public posture, public platform. And I'm not making an argument one way or another. I'm just saying that's the public platform. And the argument is that anybody who opposes this inhibits love.
Right.
What are they arguing? They're arguing for an expansion of human flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And they've successfully made that argument. And those who believe in a more traditional view of marriage, I'm in that camp, and I think you guys are probably both in that camp.
I am very much.
When we embrace a more traditional view of sexuality, we have done a poor job of explaining why our position leads to human flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And there does require some ethical and moral framework to be able to make that argument. But we live in a culture devoid of nuance. We live in a culture that wants, 30-second sound bites, and love is a pretty compelling one. And it's won the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've actually had to preach on that statement, love is love, because what I've said is everyone draws a line. So if love is love, then can a 70-year-old man marry 25 18-year-olds?
Mm-hmm.
And of
Or
course,
how about child brides? Because I work in a lot of places where that's prevalent.
yeah, love is love, right? Love is love. Who are you to say?
Right.
Yeah.
And they're going to say, well, they're minors. We'll say, who came up with the fact that 18 is a minor? Let's just make it 12,
Sure.
and that way you can marry 13-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has a line. And that's what I tend to argue in this world is, I draw my line where God's word is, and I think that's what's best. But I do agree with you, Micah. You have to make a compelling scientific argument, philosophical argument, academic argument. And this is why Christians need to be in those spheres. We do not need to run from politics. We do not need to run from the academy. We do not need to run from business. We need to be active and involved and part of those communities. And if we are part of those communities in an active and flourishing way, then we will have more of a say, which is part of one of the reasons I like what you're doing, because that, you are actively involved in a lot of these intersections where multiple different kinds of people are. So as we've got just a few minutes left, tell us a little bit about how people can interact more with you. Because, you might be back on the podcast at some point, but you're not here every week. So, tell us a little bit about where people can find you and how they can engage in these topics a little more.
Let me say this as a last sort of sales pitch before I give you the contact information. Over the last 4 years that I've done this full time, I've had better theological conversations than I've ever had in my entire life. I've shared my faith more than I've ever shared it in my entire life. 90 to 95% of the time those conversations have happened, it has been at the request of the person I'm speaking to. We've spent so much time in evangelical circles trying to figure out how do we get the gospel into these conversations. I'm telling you guys, the public wants to talk about what we believe and why we believe it. These are not taboo conversations in the public sphere. What they don't want to do is they don't want to talk to people who are angry or who they think hates them. They want to talk to someone who's going to love them, even if they profoundly disagree. And by the way, if you've got kids, you know how to love people you disagree with. This is not a foreign skill for us. We know how to do this. So, I've literally had a Muslim man ask me to explain to him a theology of the atonement. I've had a Muslim man ask me to explain to him the difference between Protestant and Catholic theology. I had a Muslim woman talk to me and ask me to help explain a Christian evangelical position on abortion and life. LGBTQ issues have been a normal part of my conversation with people in the LGBTQ community. All of these are opportunities that I have on a regular basis to share my faith, to communicate why I believe what I believe, why I believe and what I believe. But what I'm saying is, if you want to be involved in those kind of conversations, we want to help. We want you, and we're not asking for any money. There's no money involved in what we're doing. We're not asking for people to have to pay a subscription fee, that sort of thing. I mean, we just want to help people be able to engage better in the public square. So let me give you a couple ways you can be in contact. One is our organizational website. Check out the centerforpublicfaith.com, centerforpublicfaith.com. And if you scroll, it's basically just a holding page. There are links to the 4 organizations that I work with. The primary one I work with is the Multi-Faith Neighbors Network. You'll see that there's a link to that, mfnn.org. But all you got to do is go to centerforpublicfaith.com, and they're all on there. And then you can also go to micahfries.com, and there's you can contact me through that
it's
site.
not Fries?
Social media is all. It's not Fries. Can you believe it?
Shut up, Rainier.
Oh, listen, the best ever was still the person who called me Mitch Fritz. Mitch Fritz. What's up, Mitch Fritz?
That's awesome.
But yeah, check out micahfries.com and you can see MICAHFRIES.com. You can see the social media links and all that stuff. I'd love to connect with you more in the future.
Yep. Well, we appreciate you being back on the show these 2 times, Mike. It's been 2 great episodes, and I hope that if you're just catching this one, you'll go back and listen to the other ones, and of course, check out his websites there. We got a couple more ESTs coming your way, and then we will be jumping over to Rainer on Leadership. So I hope that you are going ahead and getting into your Apple Podcast, wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. Subscribe to Rainer on Leadership, and we will catch you next week.